Hello. All right. So now we have Scott Shawcraft, and he'll be talking about Python's next decade in us.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say, because I am the last speaker, I get to say thank you to all of the previous speakers. So let's give them a round of applause. I feel so lucky to be here, and I'm used to doing technical talks. This is a very big vision talk, so please strap in, and let's go on a little bit of a journey. So this is called Python's Next Decade in Us, but I think we should start by being a little reflective about how we all got here and why we are here. So you get to see some baby pictures of me. This is me on my dad's lap, although I probably look more like my dad at this point than me when I was like 1. But I was very fortunate to grow up with computers in my life. You can see here I'm getting to play around with the keyboard, and there's the computer and then the giant monitor on top. That's what computers have been most of my life. As I got a little older, I got a baby sister who I got to share things with, including the experience of playing games on computers as they were at the time. You can see this is taken out of like a VHS video, which is why the quality is terrible. But I really enjoyed the joy on our faces that we got from just being a consumer and playing on computers. It took a while for me to bridge that gap from going to be a consumer of technology to someone who created it. When I was a teenager, I was 15 in this picture, I got my first computer. This was a Christmas gift from my parents, and literally, like, it's that much of boxes, right? The monitor is gigantic. I think it was a huge, like, 19-inch monitor. And it was a Dell Dimension 8100. You know, the Dell guy. Oh, dude, you're getting a Dell. Well, I got a Dell. I was very privileged to get a Dell. It was a 1.3 gigahertz Pentium 4. It was like, I know, screamed, right? This is right after they, like, broke the gigahertz barrier. And I was so excited to get this awesome computer. Once I had that computer, I did some Linux stuff, I did some web stuff, I taught myself or learned online HTML, not really CSS. At the time, CSS was around, but not kind of the thing you did. It was a lot of tables. So I'm really good at tables. I haven't done a whole lot of HTML since then. But at some point, I wanted to make these websites dynamic, and so I decided to learn how to program. So I went to a bookstore, which is a store where they have books. And in fact, I brought the book with me, but this is a picture of it as well. And I just got out of school, and I actually dated when I learned what a function was. So June 17th, 2002, I learned what a function was. And that's how I taught myself. Thanks to these authors that wrote this book, they were my teachers. But I also did quickly grow out of a book. I was fortunate enough to grow up when there was the internet. Some folks learned to code before the internet. So I dug on the Wayback Machine and found the site that I remembered going to learn how to do the things that I was actually interested in doing, like online polls. I wanted to make an online poll, and so I learned MySQL and PHP. There's a site called Developer Shed, which they shortened to DevShed, and that was my go-to that summer and the few years after that, where I learned more and more of how to program, how to actually use the tool that a computer was rather than just playing the games on it. So at some point, I was like, I'm going to make a desktop app, right? I've been doing all this fancy web stuff, but I've been doing this Linux, and I have this problem that I'm using like Fluxbox. It's not like a traditional window manager style thing, and there was no great way at the time to actually keep track of what programs you had installed and get them in the menu. So I was like, I know what I'll do. I'm going to go to the bookstore again. I'm going to decide which language I'm going to learn now so I can do desktop apps. And I settled on Python. I found a book. I don't have that book anymore because I think I largely just went online and learned it. But I made this PyGTK app to manage what you have on a menu in your Linux computer. In fact, I pulled this image off the SourceForge page that still exists. So thank you so much to the folks at SourceForge for keeping that content around. I have one other SourceForge story. As a beginner programmer, I remember at the time you actually had to write a paragraph or two about what your project was, and you'd send it off to SourceForge, and they'd get back to you and say, oh yeah, we'll host it. It's cool. And I remember that intermediate period where I was like, are they going to accept it? Is it enough? I'm just like a kid sitting in his room working on stuff. But they did, and I really appreciate it for them for doing that. So that's my story about how I met computers, how I started using computers, how I started programming them, and how I found Python. And I want to just take 10 seconds for everyone to think about that. What was your first computer? What was your first programming language? And how do you find Python? So think about it. All right. I don't know how long that was, but we'll call it. I hope that brought some nostalgia back to you. It's certainly digging through these old photos did for me. Now that I've talked about myself, and you've thought about yourself and your experience, let's broaden this. Let's go the other direction and talk about computing trends. And where do you go to look at computing trends? None other than the Stack Overflow survey that they publish every year. I took this out of the 2019 one. This is the most popular technologies in 2019. We can see that Python is fourth, which is awesome. Remember that people can check multiple technologies, so these numbers definitely don't add up. If we scroll down, we get a summary of it. The summary says, for the 7th year in a row, JavaScript is the most commonly used programming language, but Python has risen in the ranks again. And then they end with, Python is the fastest growing major programming language today. That's pretty exciting, right? You want to applause? I think it's pretty exciting. And that's to credit everybody who's worked on Python. Now, what do you think the most important piece of information on this slide is? It's probably the thing in gray, right? The most important thing is definitely always in gray. And that most important thing in my mind is the number of responses that Stack Overflow got to create this chart. That number is 87,354. As somebody who developed a lot of websites nobody ever used, that's a big number, right? Maybe that many people use CircuitPython, which is what I work on now. But in reality, how big is that number actually? How many people are there in this world? Well, I looked it up. Some smart people have come up with an estimate, and that's 7.7-ish billion people. That number is much, much bigger than the number who took the Stack Overflow survey. And let's reimagine that chart and combine everything. I've corrected the chart. I've introduced a category called not coders and coders. And I munged all the languages together because I think this is the most important bit. The most important bit, and these numbers here are the total number of people in the world, 7.7 billion, over the 87,000. So we'll adapt it a little bit. But for every one of you in this room and everyone watching, there are 200 people that do not know how to program a computer. I mean coders in the broadest sense, so think about that. Think about what you've been able to do because you know how to use a computer, and imagine that there are 200 people that are unable to do that. I looked up the actual number that people estimate for developers, and it turns out it's more like 24 million, 23.9 million. And that was at the end of 2018. That number is a lot larger than 87,000, but it's still not that much. We still have 0.31% that are coders of everyone in the world. Now, the other aspect is that not everyone in this world has a computer. There's a lot of us, and not everyone owns a computer yet. But how many people do have a computer? Well, those computers they have are not like the computers that I grew up with and many of us grew up with. Last year, I looked up the numbers. These are from Gartner for total sales last year. And there were 261 million sales of desktop and laptop computers. On the smartphone side, there was 1.5-ish billion smartphones sold last year. That's a lot, right? That's a ton. I looked up a number for how many mobile phone connections there were in the world, and it was 5.1 billion people have access to mobile phones. That's about more than half of that are smartphones. So even if we adjust all of these numbers, we lower the total number of people we think could code because they have a computer, we raise up the number for how many people are actually developers, we still find that there are 200 people. I gave you a stat too early. 200 people for everyone here and watching in the world that can program on a computer. There are 200 people who cannot. That's astounding to me. And that makes me feel like when we talk about is JavaScript better, or is Python better, or is Rust better, we're not asking the right question. The right question is, we are all on the same side, and what can we do better to bring these other 99% of the world into our club where we know how to program computers, and we can use them as a tool, as the tool that they are. So let's take a look at other languages and see what awesome things they're doing. Rust, if you haven't looked, the first thing I want to talk about is that they're doing really, really cool memory management things. There is no garbage collecting. You have to pay attention to what memory is used by whom and how long. But they have really nice mechanics so that the compiler can verify the things that you're assuming. They call it safe code. And if you've ever done C, like I have, you know you're living in the Wild West of probably correct, but definitely unsafe code. And they're building a tool so that they can be safe. I love this tagline on their website. I pulled this last week. It says, "A language empowering everyone to build reliable and efficient software." Not just the people visiting the website, but everyone. The other aspect of Rust that you should really pay attention to, and I put the YouTube link because you should go watch this talk. It's a talk by Emily Dunham, who's at Mozilla, and was one of the people involved in the early Rust community. This talk is all about the things that you can set up so that your community is welcoming and inclusive. It is so good. I've started a community in the last few years, and I borrowed so many of the ideas from this talk. I highly, highly recommend it. That's the other thing that Rust has been doing really well. I was doing an app on a phone, and I was using React Native. I was looking at the React docs, and I came across their documentation page. It has a languages button in the top right-hand corner. Turns out of 7.7 billion, not everyone speaks English. In fact, there's a lot of people who don't. And they've taken the effort to translate their docs into many different languages. This is just the top of the page, and what you'll see is this section is the documentation that has been translated enough that they feel comfortable saying it's ready. So there's just 4. I think there were more. I didn't actually count. But if you scroll further down the page, they're like, here's the other docs that we have in languages that need some help and need some work. It's a call to action immediately on the page, and they're doing that to be as inclusive as possible. And I think that's really, really awesome. Lastly, I want to point out Jupyter and Colab. They're inverting code in my mind. Whereas I read a lot of code and I put in comments, and like as we said earlier, the most important stuff is in gray. Typically, your editor will make your comments gray. But Jupyter and Colab are really interesting because they invert that paradigm. They are a prose-first way of programming computers. I think that's really cool, and I applaud them for it. So that brings us back to Python. Thank you. We are doing awesome, I think. Python is an amazing, amazing language, an amazing community. But I want us to ground ourselves in what we talked about earlier, how we came to Python, why did we use it, and as we go forward, think of that. So think about, what will Python be in the next 10 years? What will you be doing with Python in 2030? Is it weird if I say it like that? How much effort will we be putting into the 2038 problem? Does it even have it? I don't know. There's so many things that Python can do. We saw painting, like co-artistry. We saw poetry. And now, what if you bring these 5.1 billion people into Python as well? What will Python or any other language or any computing thing be able to do if those 5.1 billion people can use it? So, I am not going to try to predict the future. I think a lot of people have made that mistake. But I do want to give you a guideline on how I think we're going to get there. And I'm going to do that by repurposing the notion of TLC. Tends to stand for tender love and care, but I'm going to call it something else. The first one is teach. For every one of you, there are 200 people who do not know how to code. Please help teach them how to. That doesn't mean you have to sit down next to them and help them code or teach them Python or whatever language you're comfortable with. It can be in a variety of forms, right? Like my first experience was something called a book. If you want to author a book to teach someone else, that is awesome. If you want to create a live stream of the code that you do, that is awesome. People will see it on YouTube. If you want to write a tutorial on a site called DevShed, I'm sorry, it doesn't exist anymore. But there are plenty of other sites where you can write tutorials for people. And by doing that, we'll listen to the people that we're teaching. It is the internet. They will let you know what they think. If they're mean, block them and don't listen to them. But if they're nice, think about the terminology that they're using when they ask a question. It might be weird to you, but that's good, because we should reintegrate that terminology into our documentation because someone is thinking about it like that. Think about the things that they're trying to do with it. Ask them the big picture. What is the problem you have? Are you using Fluxbox and you want to make sure all your programs are in the menu? Let me help you do that. It may be something different. It might be sculpting. We've seen painting, but what if it's like chiseling out a piece of stone? I think we could see that in the next year. How awesome would that be? One of those 5.1 billion people, I'm sure, know how to do it. We've just got to get them there. So listen to what they're doing. Lastly, contribute. Once you've learned the things that people need and how they think about it, you're going to find all these bumps in the road. Like somebody, I tried this and I got to this point and it was just so hard, right? We've all heard that somebody just, they fell off, it was too hard. Step back, contribute to the projects, smooth out the bumps. The more people we have involved, the more diverse what Python and coding and computing can do. Contributing can be any sort of thing, right? We are coders. It doesn't have to be code, though. There is so much more to coding than code itself. There's documentation. I talked about languages, but there's also testing and issue filing and answering questions on a support forum. Don't forget about those things, because those things are what characterize a project, not just the code itself. All right. I've gone fast, so we'll all be able to get out of here. But first, I want to recap what I've talked about. And I reiterated, or I changed the name of my talk. It's not Python's next decade. It's computing's next decade. Python is a part of that, and who knows how big that part will be come 10 years. But it doesn't matter. because if we're in a better spot, we'll be in a better spot, and that's cool. And it doesn't just involve us, thank you, it involves everyone, all 7.8-ish billion people, and the people to come as well. They're not going to have, we talked about and reflected on our experiences with computers and what they were. They're not going to be a computer with a giant monitor. I don't think people are selling those anymore because they're really heavy. They're going to be a phone or a computer you can hold in your hand. And how does that change the paradigm of, like, I want to sculpt something out of stone, and yet I have a phone? How does that work? How does that person go from thinking about a computer as a gaming device or something they read the news on to something that they understand crunches numbers one after another just insanely fast? But everything that it's doing has been told either explicitly or implicitly by a person to do it. So, totally blanked. This is the part I was worried about most, the end. So what do? I was not going to make predictions about having 512 gigabytes of RAM be the most you could ever need. But I wanted to say, I know how we can get there, right? You can teach, you can listen, and you can contribute. And if we all do that, we're going to end up in an awesome spot in 2030 and beyond. Thank you.